Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey that will take you deep into the heart of the wild and the human spirit. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support means the world to us. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to be immersed in the gripping tale of stranded in silence, survival alone, and nature's heart. The world ended for Elias Thorne not with a bang, but with a terrifying, grinding shriek. One moment, he was gazing out of the small plane window, admiring the tapestry of ancient forest and jagged peaks below. The next, a violent shudder ripped through the fuselage. The pilot, a grizzled man named Arthur, wrestled with the controls, his face a mask of grim determination. "Engines out," he bellowed, his voice barely audible above the sudden guttural roar of wind. Elias, a successful architect whose life was usually dictated by blueprints and urban landscapes, found himself utterly unprepared for the raw, visceral terror that seized him. He clutched the armrests, his knuckles white, as the plane pitched violently, a desperate leaf caught in an unseen current. The descent was agonizingly slow, yet terrifyingly swift. Trees, once distant emerald specks, became monstrous, grasping claws rushing upwards. The last thing Elias remembered before the impact was Arthur's final, choked cry, and then a world of splintering metal, tearing fabric, and the deafening symphony of destruction. When consciousness returned, it was not with a jolt, but a gradual, disorienting crawl. A throbbing pain resonated behind his eyes, a dull ache in his ribs. He lay amidst twisted metal and shredded seats, the scent of aviation fuel and damp earth heavy in the air. A profound silence had replaced the cacophony. Not the comforting silence of a quiet room, but an oppressive, all-encompassing void that seemed to swallow every sound. He pushed himself up, every movement a protest from his battered body. Arthur was nowhere to be seen, nor was the small co-pilot. The plane had ripped apart, a scattering of debris across a small, moss-laden clearing. Towering, ancient trees, their branches interlaced like a protective canopy, loomed on all sides, blocking out the sky. This was not the manicured wilderness of a national park. This was primeval, untamed. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. A shudder, unrelated to the chill, ran down his spine. He was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone. The realization settled upon him like a heavy shroud, pressing down on his chest until breathing felt like a monumental effort. He was stranded in silence. The enormity of his situation threatened to consume him, a cold dread creeping into his bones. His mind, usually so sharp and analytical, felt numb, paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying scale of his predicament. Survival. The word echoed in his mind, hollow and meaningless. He, Elias Thorne, who relied on takeout and air conditioning, was now face to face with the indifferent, unforgiving heart of nature. He had to move. He had to do something. But what? Where did one even begin when the world had just fallen apart around them? The first rays of dawn, hesitant and pale, pierced through the dense foliage, painting streaks of weak light across the wreckage. Elias shivered, the cold seeping into his bones. He had spent the night huddled beneath a section of the plane's wing, listening to the unsettling symphony of the forest, rustles, snaps, and distant, unidentifiable calls. Sleep had been a fragmented, terrifying affair, punctuated by nightmares of falling and the chilling realization of his isolation. His ribs ached, a deep, persistent throb with every breath, and a nasty gash on his forehead had clotted, leaving him with a stiff, matted patch of hair. He needed to assess his situation, to find water, to find anything useful. Survival, he knew from countless documentaries and adventure novels, began with the basics: water, shelter, food, fire. In that order, his eyes scanned the debris field. The fuselage was largely intact but twisted, a grotesque metal carcass. He gingerly explored the wreckage, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and a nascent spark of hope. The pilot, Arthur, was indeed gone. A grim confirmation that Elias was truly alone. He found a small, dented metal thermos, miraculously still holding a few sips of water, a precious, life-saving gift. He rationed it, allowing only a small, moistening sip to ease his parched throat. Among the scattered belongings, he discovered a small, battered backpack. Inside, a first aid kit, surprisingly complete. A waterproof lighter, a multi-tool, and a partially eaten energy bar. These items felt like a king's ransom. The multi-tool, in particular, seemed an extension of his own capabilities. A tiny beacon of man-made ingenuity in this overwhelming natural world. He cleaned his forehead wound, wincing at the sting of antiseptic wipes, and bandaged his ribs as best he could. The pain was still there, but now it was a dull companion rather than a paralyzing enemy. His mind, slowly emerging from the fog of shock, began to churn. He needed water, not just sips, but a sustainable source. He remembered Arthur mentioning a river, a winding artery through this wilderness, but which direction? He stood up, wobbling slightly, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, clean, imbued with the scent of pine and damp earth. He looked up, trying to gauge the sun's position, but the canopy was too thick. He had no compass, no map, only a vague sense of direction from the plane's flight path. He decided to follow the gentle slope of the land, hoping it would lead him to a lower elevation and perhaps a water source. The fear was still a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now tempered by a growing resolve. He was alive. And as long as he was alive, he would fight. He would survive. He took his first hesitant steps into the unknown forest, the multi-tool clutched tightly in his hand, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent expanse of nature. Hours blurred into a monotonous march through the dense undergrowth. Every branch that snagged his clothes, every root that tripped his feet, felt like a personal assault. His ribs throbbed with increasing intensity, and his legs, accustomed to urban pavement, protested with every step. The forest was a labyrinth of towering trees, their ancient trunks draped in moss, their canopies so thick that only scattered rays of sunlight managed to penetrate, creating an eternal twilight on the forest floor. He called out Arthur's name a few times, a desperate, hoarse whisper that was swallowed instantly by the vast silence, leaving only the echo of his own desperation. His voice sounded alien, out of place in this primeval realm. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, a gentle gurgle. He stopped dead, straining to hear it again. There it was. The unmistakable whisper of flowing water. A surge of adrenaline, potent and exhilarating, coursed through his veins, momentarily eclipsing the pain and exhaustion. He stumbled forward, pushing through a thicket of thorny bush, ignoring the scratches on his arms. The sound grew louder, transforming from a whisper to a playful murmur, then to a joyful babble, and then he saw it. A narrow, crystalline stream, winding its way through rocks smoothed by centuries of erosion. The water was clear, sparkling, inviting. He knelt by its edge, his hands trembling, and scooped up a generous amount. It was cold, pure, and utterly revitalizing. He drank deeply, greedily, the cool liquid washing away the dust and fear from his throat, a primal satisfaction spreading through him. It was the purest, most delicious water he had ever tasted. He spent the next hour by the stream, resting, allowing the cool water to soothe his aching body. He refilled the thermos and his empty water bottle. The stream, he reasoned, must eventually lead to a larger body of water, perhaps the river Arthur had mentioned. It was a lifeline, a direction, a purpose. He also took the opportunity to inspect his surroundings more closely. The area around the stream was relatively open, providing a potential site for a more substantial shelter than his flimsy wing cover. He spotted several fallen logs, partially rotted but still sturdy, and an abundance of smaller branches and leaves. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows through the trees. The temperature was already dropping. He knew he couldn't afford another night without adequate protection. The thought of the unseen creatures that roamed these woods, the chilling sounds of the previous night, spurred him into action. With his multi-tool, he began to clear a small area near the stream, pushing aside rocks and thorny undergrowth. He was an architect, he reminded himself, a builder. This was just a different kind of structure, a more fundamental one. He focused on the task, each swing of his improvised tool, each drag of a branch, a small victory against the encroaching wilderness. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath his resolve, but now it was a motivator, not a paralyzer. He had found water, he would find shelter. He would survive. Building a shelter was a monumental task, far more physically demanding than anything Elias had ever undertaken. His hands, soft from years of office work, quickly blistered and ached. But the cold, the encroaching darkness, and the primal need for safety drove him on. He used two sturdy, low-hanging branches as the foundational uprights, leaning larger fallen logs against them to form a rudimentary A-frame. He then wove smaller branches and saplings through this framework, creating a lattice. It was crude, imperfect, but it was taking shape. Each successful placement of a branch, each tightening of a vine-like root he used as lashing, brought a surge of satisfaction. He was creating something with his own hands, something vital. As the last vestiges of daylight faded, he began gathering armfuls of pine needles and large, broad leaves to layer over the frame, creating insulation and a barrier against the elements. The air grew colder still, and a thin mist began to rise from the stream, chilling him to the bone. He worked frantically, his breath misting in the air, his body aching but his mind singularly focused. By the time the stars began to prick through the gaps in the canopy, a small, enclosed space, barely large enough for him to lie down, stood near the stream. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't comfortable, but it was a shelter, a roof over his head. A profound sense of accomplishment, mixed with bone-deep exhaustion, washed over him. He crawled inside his makeshift dwelling, pulling a tattered piece of airplane fabric he'd salvaged over the small opening. The space was cramped, permeated with the scent of damp earth and pine, but it offered a tangible sense of security. He lay on a bed of gathered leaves and soft moss, his body protesting every movement, but his mind finally allowing a modicum of peace. The sounds of the forest, which had been so menacing the previous night, now seemed distant, muffled by his crude walls. He was still vulnerable, still alone, but he had taken a significant step toward survival. He thought of his comfortable apartment, his expensive bed, the warmth of his heating system. The contrast was stark, almost laughable. Yet there was a strange, raw satisfaction in his current state. He had built this. He had made it through another day. The energy bar, eaten sparingly throughout the day, had provided just enough sustenance. He needed fire desperately. Not just for warmth, but for cooking, for purifying water, for psychological comfort, and for signaling. The waterproof lighter was a godsend, but he knew its fuel was finite. He needed to learn how to make fire without it. That would be tomorrow's challenge. Tonight, he would rest, allowing his body to heal, his mind to process the day's brutal lessons. He closed his eyes, the image of his crude shelter, a testament to his burgeoning will, burning brightly in his mind. Sleep came, not as a torment, but as a much-needed oblivion, a brief respite from the relentless struggle for existence. The morning brought a renewed chill, but Elias awoke with a clarity of purpose. His body still ached, but the deep, restorative sleep within his rudimentary shelter had done wonders for his morale. Today was about fire. The waterproof lighter, while a temporary solution, wouldn't last forever. He needed a sustainable method. He remembered vague lessons from childhood camping trips, snippets from survival shows, friction fire, flint, and steel. He had neither flint nor steel in the traditional sense, but he had the multi-tool. Its small, sturdy blade might serve. He spent the early hours scouting for suitable materials. Dry tinder was paramount. He gathered fine, wispy strands of dried grass, shredded bark from dead trees, and the delicate, papery inner bark of a birch tree he recognized. For fuel, he collected small, dry twigs, gradually increasing in size. He found 2 pieces of relatively flat, dry wood, one harder for a fireboard and a softer piece for a spindle. He knew the theory. Rub the spindle against the fireboard, creating friction, generating heat, and eventually, a glowing ember. The first attempts were frustrating. His hands, still raw from building the shelter, blistered anew. The wood slipped, the technique felt clumsy, and the tiny pile of tinder remained stubbornly cold. Despair gnawed at him. What if he couldn't do it? What if this essential skill eluded him? The thought of prolonged cold, of raw food, of an unlit night, was a powerful motivator. He paused, took a deep breath, and tried to recall the specific mechanics: pressure, speed, consistency. He adjusted his grip, leaned into the spindle with renewed vigor, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the grime. He worked with a fierce, almost desperate intensity. The smell of burning wood began to emerge, faint at first, then stronger. A tiny wisp of smoke curled upwards. His heart pounded. He increased his speed, the friction groaning. And then a small, dark ember, no bigger than a pea, appeared in the dust-filled groove of the fireboard. It was a miracle. A tiny, glowing speck of life. He carefully transferred the ember to his prepared tinder nest, cupping it gently, blowing on it with soft, steady breaths. The tinder began to smoke, then smolder, and then, with a triumphant whoosh, a small flame erupted. Elias stared at it, mesmerized, a profound sense of awe and relief washing over him. He quickly fed it with the smallest twigs, nurturing it, watching it grow into a robust, crackling fire. The warmth was immediate, a physical comfort that chased away the morning chill. But it was more than just physical warmth. It was a psychological balm, a defiant symbol of human ingenuity against the wilderness. He had a fire. He could boil water, cook, stay warm, and keep predators at bay. The crackle and pop of the flames were the sweetest music he had heard in days, a counterpoint to the oppressive silence. He sat by the fire, simply watching it, feeling its heat, a faint smile touching his lips. He was learning. He was adapting. He was surviving. With fire now a reliable companion, Elias's camp near the stream transformed from a desperate huddle to a fledgling home. The small A-frame shelter felt more secure, warmed by the nearby flames. The fire allowed him to boil water, making it safe to drink, and to dry out his damp clothing. He even managed to roast a few edible roots he'd identified, their earthy taste a welcome change from the energy bar's artificial sweetness. The multi-tool, salvaged from the crash, proved invaluable, not just for fire starting, but for cutting, prying, and even rudimentary carving. Each day became a lesson in observation and adaptation. He began to explore his immediate surroundings, venturing further from his camp along the stream. He carved notches into trees to mark his path, a crude but effective way to avoid getting lost in the bewildering sameness of the forest. He learned to identify different types of trees, understanding which offered good firewood, which bore edible nuts or berries, and which had bark suitable for cordage. The forest, initially a terrifying monolithic entity, slowly began to reveal its intricate details, its subtle rhythms. He found a small, sheltered alcove in a rock face, a natural pantry where he could store his meager provisions, protected from rain and curious animals. He discovered a patch of wild garlic, its pungent aroma a welcome addition to his bland diet. He even fashioned a simple fishing spear from a sturdy branch, sharpening its tip with the multi-tool, though his initial attempts at fishing were met with comical failure. The fish, it seemed, were far more adept at survival than he was. The silence, once so suffocating, began to change. He started to discern the distinct calls of birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant hoot of an owl. These were no longer just menacing sounds. They were the voices of his new home, a constant, gentle hum of life. He still felt the pangs of loneliness, a deep ache for human connection, but the immediate, paralyzing fear had receded, replaced by a cautious respect for the wilderness and a growing confidence in his own burgeoning abilities. He started making a mental map of his immediate territory, a radius of about a mile around his camp. He noted landmarks, a distinctive twisted oak, a large boulder split by lightning, a small waterfall further upstream. He found a small, relatively open meadow a short walk from his camp, bathed in sunlight, a perfect spot for sunning himself and drying his clothes. This meadow also presented itself as a potential signaling point should he ever hear or see a plane. He was not abandoning hope of rescue, but he was also embracing the reality of his situation. He was here now, and he needed to live. The days began to take on a rhythm, dictated by the sun and his basic needs. Wake, tend the fire, check snares, which he'd learned to set with simple loops of vine, forage, explore, build, improve. Each evening, as the stars emerged, he would sit by his fire, the warmth a comforting presence, reflecting on the day's small victories and planning for tomorrow's challenges. He was no longer just surviving. He was learning to live in nature's heart, carving out his own small niche in its vast, silent expanse. Weeks turned into a month, and Elias's body, once soft and unaccustomed to physical labor, hardened. His muscles grew lean and strong, his movements more fluid and efficient. His hands, though scarred and calloused, had become tools in themselves, capable of intricate tasks. He had learned to identify a wider range of edible plants, wild onions, various mushrooms, after meticulous and cautious testing, and even certain types of lichen. His diet was monotonous, but it was enough to sustain him. He had also learned to set more effective snares, supplementing his plant-based diet with occasional small game, rabbits, squirrels, and once a plump grouse. Preparing and cooking these animals was a messy, uncomfortable process, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of survival, but the protein was essential. He also learned the forest's dangers. He narrowly avoided a run-in with the black bear, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the massive creature from a safe distance, its immense power a humbling display. He learned to recognize the subtle signs of its presence: claw marks on trees, overturned rocks, fresh scat. He understood that he was an intruder in their world, and he moved with increasing caution and respect. Poison ivy became a familiar enemy, its itchy rash a constant nuisance. He developed a keen sense of awareness, his senses honed by necessity. Every rustle, every snap of a twig was registered, analyzed. He moved through the forest like a shadow, his urban self slowly shedding its layers, revealing a more primal, attuned being underneath. The solitude, however, remained his most persistent adversary. The initial terror had faded, replaced by a deep, aching loneliness. He would often talk to himself, narrating his day's activities, discussing strategies, just to hear the sound of a human voice. He began to carve simple figures from wood, small, crude representations of animals, or abstract shapes, a way to channel his need for creative expression, a desperate attempt to assert his humanity in a world that sought to strip it away. These carvings were his silent companions, witnesses to his struggle. One day, while foraging further upstream, he stumbled upon a small, isolated pond, its surface covered in lily pads, surrounded by tall reeds. It was a serene, almost magical place. He noticed movement in the water, small, iridescent fish darting between the reeds. He refined his fishing spear, patiently waiting, and after several misses, managed to catch 2 small fish. It was a triumph, not just for the food, but for the skill, the patience, the connection to the rhythm of the wild. He brought them back to camp, cleaned and cooked them over the fire, the aroma of sizzling fish a rare luxury. Eating the fresh fish, sitting by his fire as twilight deepened, Elias felt a profound sense of peace. It was a fleeting moment, he knew, but it was real. The forest was still dangerous, still indifferent, but it was also providing. It was testing him, yes, but it was also teaching him. He was a part of it now, not just an outsider, and in that realization there was a strange, unexpected comfort. He was finding his place, not in the world he knew, but in this ancient silent heart of nature. The passage of time became fluid, marked not by dates or appointments, but by the waxing and waning of the moon, the subtle shifts in the forest's palette, the changing patterns of the animal kingdom. Elias knew it had been months, perhaps 3 or 4 since the crash. Autumn was slowly yielding to the colder breath of winter. The leaves, once vibrant green, had exploded into a riot of reds, oranges, and yellows, now beginning to fall, carpeting the forest floor in a thick, rustling blanket. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. This shift in seasons brought a new, urgent challenge, preparing for winter. He began to fortify his shelter. He gathered more logs, reinforcing the walls, and piled an even thicker layer of leaves and moss for insulation. He found a way to create a rudimentary door from interwoven branches and bark, further sealing off his dwelling from the biting wind. He spent hours collecting and stacking firewood, creating an impressive pile that he hoped would last him through the harshest months. Every spare moment was dedicated to preparation, a relentless race against the inevitable freeze. Food became a more pressing concern. The berries were gone, the edible roots harder to find. Small game was scarcer, many animals preparing for hibernation or migrating. His snares yielded less. He had to be more ingenious, more patient. He began experimenting with different types of traps, learning from the tracks he saw in the mud and snow. He also ventured further, hoping to find a larger animal, perhaps a deer, but his hunting skills were still rudimentary, and he lacked the proper tools for such a kill. The thought of hunger, real, gnawing hunger, began to settle in, a cold dread far more insidious than the physical chill. The loneliness deepened with the colder weather. The forest, once bustling with the sounds of summer, grew quieter, its silence more profound, more isolating. The long, dark nights stretched endlessly, filled only with the crackle of his fire and the whispers of his own thoughts. He missed conversation, laughter, the simple presence of another human being. He found himself staring into the flames for hours, his mind drifting to memories of his old life, the bustling city, friends, family. These memories were a double-edged sword, offering comfort but also sharpening the pang of loss. One evening, a heavy snowfall began, coating the forest in a pristine white blanket. It was beautiful, ethereal, transforming the harsh landscape into a wonderland. But Elias saw it with a survivor's eye, a beautiful, deadly challenge. The snow would make foraging harder, obscure tracks, and deepen the cold. He sat by his fire, watching the flakes fall, a profound weariness settling over him. He had faced so much, overcome so much, but winter was a different beast entirely. It demanded everything and gave nothing. He knew he had to be stronger, more resilient than ever before. The weight of time, measured in the relentless march of seasons, pressed down on him, a heavy, silent burden. Winter arrived in full force, a brutal, relentless assault of cold and snow. The stream, once a cheerful babble, now flowed sluggishly, its edges fringed with ice. The ground was locked in a frozen grip, making foraging for roots impossible. Elias relied almost entirely on his stored provisions and what meager game his traps could provide. His days became a grueling cycle of tending the fire, melting snow for water, and checking snares. The cold was pervasive, seeping into his bones despite the roaring fire in his shelter. He wrapped himself in layers of salvaged fabric from the plane wreckage, but the biting wind found every crevice. The forest was transformed into a stark, monochrome landscape. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the snow or the occasional distant cry of a hawk. The beauty was undeniable, the snow-laden branches, the sparkling frost on every surface, but it was a beauty that held a chilling indifference to his struggle. He suffered from frostbite on his fingers and toes, painful reminders of nature's unforgiving power. His diet was meager, leading to a constant, dull ache of hunger. He lost weight, his face growing gaunt, his eyes deeply set. The psychological toll of the winter was immense. The short days and endless nights amplified his loneliness. He spent long hours in his shelter, huddled by the fire, carving intricate designs into small pieces of wood, his only outlet for creativity and a desperate attempt to maintain his sanity. He dreamt of hot food, of warm baths, of human voices. These dreams were vivid, almost painfully real, and waking from them was always a harsh return to his stark reality. He developed a deep, almost instinctual understanding of the cold. He learned to read the subtle changes in the wind, to anticipate snowstorms, to find the most sheltered spots in the forest. He became more efficient in his movements, conserving precious energy. He understood that every decision, every action, could mean the difference between life and death. The wilderness was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, a formidable opponent that demanded respect and constant vigilance. One particularly brutal storm raged for 3 days, trapping Elias in his shelter. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the crude walls, and the snow piled up outside, threatening to bury his tiny refuge. He rationed his last piece of dried meat, watching the fire carefully, ensuring it wouldn't die. In those dark, claustrophobic hours, a profound sense of despair threatened to swallow him whole. He felt utterly helpless, a tiny speck against the overwhelming force of nature. Yet something deep within him refused to yield, a stubborn, primal will to live. He would not give up. He would endure. He would survive winter's cruel, silent embrace. Just as Elias thought his spirit might finally break, a subtle shift began to occur. The days, almost imperceptibly at first, started to lengthen. The sun, though still weak, felt a little warmer on his face. The rigid grip of winter began to loosen its hold. The first sign was the sound of trickling water, as ice began to melt and the stream, once sluggish, found its voice again. Then came the faintest hints of green, tiny, tenacious shoots pushing through the melting snow, a promise of life renewing. Spring was arriving, slowly, hesitantly, but with an undeniable force. The forest, which had been silent and stark, began to awaken. Birds, many of which had migrated, returned, their songs a vibrant symphony after months of silence. Small animals emerged from hibernation, their tracks crisscrossing the thawing ground. Elias felt a profound sense of relief, a lifting of the heavy burden that winter had placed upon him. His body, though still lean, began to regain some of its strength as more food sources became available. The first wild ramps, their garlicky scent a welcome aroma, were a culinary triumph. He found early spring greens, bitter but nutritious, and began to forage with renewed vigor. His snares, which had been mostly empty through the winter, now yielded more consistent catches. He even managed to catch a small trout from the now flowing stream, a testament to his improved fishing skills and the abundance of the season. The world was coming alive again, and so was he. He spent hours simply observing, watching the forest transform. He saw deer emerging from the deeper woods, their coats still thick from winter, grazing on the new shoots. He watched squirrels burying and unearthing nuts, their frantic energy a stark contrast to the slow pace of winter. He felt a deep, almost spiritual connection to this cycle of death and rebirth. The wilderness had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but it had also shown him its immense resilience, its unwavering capacity for renewal. The loneliness, though still present, was less crushing. The vibrant life around him filled some of the void. He found himself talking less to himself, instead finding companionship in the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, the bubbling stream. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a part of this ecosystem, a quiet observer and participant in its ancient rhythms. The thought of rescue, which had faded into a distant dream during the depths of winter, now flickered back to life. With clearer skies and warmer weather, there was a greater chance of planes flying overhead. He began to think about signaling again, about ways to make his presence known. But even if rescue never came, Elias knew he had changed irrevocably. He had faced the heart of nature, and he had found a way to live within it. The glimmer of green was more than just a sign of spring. It was a glimmer of hope, a testament to his endurance, and a promise of continued life in the wild. With the full bloom of spring, Elias's existence settled into a sustainable routine. His shelter, now well insulated, almost comfortable dwelling, felt truly like home. He had refined his tools, a sturdy digging stick, a better fishing spear, and even a crude, but effective bow and arrow, painstakingly crafted from flexible wood and sinew from animal hides. His aim with the bow was still far from perfect, but it represented a significant leap in his hunting capabilities. He spent hours practicing, his patience growing with each missed shot, each small improvement. Patience had become his most valuable asset. He learned to sit for long periods, absolutely still, observing the movements of animals, understanding their habits, their feeding grounds, their vulnerabilities. He learned to stalk silently, his footsteps barely disturbing the forest floor. He became a hunter, not out of sport, but out of necessity, a part of the food chain. He recognized the delicate balance of the ecosystem, taking only what he needed, never wasting. The forest, in turn, often rewarded his patience, providing enough to keep him alive. He also dedicated time to improving his camp. He built a small, elevated platform for drying meat and herbs, keeping them safe from ground animals. He created a small, rock-lined fire pit outside his shelter for cooking, and a separate, smaller one inside for warmth during cold nights. He even managed to fashion a crude container from bark and sap, allowing him to carry larger quantities of water from the stream. Each improvement, no matter how small, brought a deep satisfaction, a sense of control over his immediate environment. The days were long, filled with purposeful activity, yet there was a quiet meditative quality to his work. The rhythmic swing of his axe as he chopped firewood, the focused concentration as he mended a snare, the slow, deliberate movements of foraging, all these tasks became rituals, grounding him in the present moment. He no longer dwelled on the past with the same intensity, nor did he constantly yearn for the future. He was fully immersed in the now. The solitude, while still a part of his life, had lost much of its sting. He had learned to find companionship in the rustling leaves, the chirping birds, the distant cries of larger animals. He spoke to them, sometimes in a low, murmuring voice, acknowledging their presence, feeling a part of their world. He was no longer fighting the silence. He was listening to it, understanding its nuances, finding peace within its vast embrace. He knew he was no longer the Elias Thorne who had boarded that plane. That man was gone, stripped away by the wilderness, replaced by someone stronger, more resilient, more attuned to the fundamental truths of existence. He carried the scars, both physical and emotional, of his ordeal, but he also carried a profound wisdom, a deep understanding of what truly mattered. He was a creature of the wild now, and in the art of patience, he found not just survival, but a deeper connection to life itself. Despite his profound transformation and his growing comfort in the wilderness, there were moments when the echoes of his past life would resurface with jarring clarity. A particular scent, perhaps of pine needles mixed with damp earth, might trigger a memory of a childhood camping trip. The rhythmic sound of the stream could remind him of the distant hum of city traffic. In these moments, the walls of his self-imposed isolation would feel thin, almost transparent, allowing glimpses of the world he had lost. He missed the simple things: a hot shower, a comfortable chair, the ability to read a book, the taste of coffee. But most of all, he missed human connection. The casual banter with colleagues, the laughter with friends, the warmth of a loved one's touch. He would sometimes trace the outlines of faces in the flickering firelight, conjuring images of those he had left behind. Were they searching for him? Had they given up hope? The uncertainty was a heavy burden, a constant dull ache beneath the surface of his new existence. He still carried a small, water-damaged photograph, salvaged from his wallet, a picture of his parents, smiling, vibrant. He would look at it sometimes, the faces blurred, but the love still palpable, and a profound sadness would wash over him. He wondered if they thought he was gone, lost forever. The guilt of leaving them in such agonizing uncertainty was a torment. He would whisper apologies into the silent forest, promises he couldn't keep. Yet these moments of reflection were also tempered by a fierce pride in what he had accomplished. He, Elias Thornton, the city architect, had survived. He had built a life, however rudimentary, and a world that sought to consume him. He had learned skills he never imagined possessing, found strengths he never knew he had. His old life, with its stresses and superficialities, seemed distant, almost alien. He realized that while he missed the people, he didn't miss the rat race, the constant striving, the artificial demands. He began to write, or rather, to carve. Using a sharpened stick, he would scratch words onto flattened pieces of birch bark. A diary of sorts, a record of his days, his thoughts, his struggles, his triumphs. It was a way to process his experiences, to externalize his inner world, and to leave a message, however unlikely it was to be found. He wrote about the beauty of the forest, the harshness of winter, the taste of wild berries, the satisfaction of a well-made trap. He wrote about his loneliness, his fear, and his unwavering hope. The act of writing, even in this primitive form, was cathartic. It connected him to his humanity, to the long lineage of storytellers and record keepers. It was a bridge between his past self and his present self, a testament to the enduring human need for meaning and connection, even in the deepest silence. He was still Elias Thorne, but he was also more. He was a survivor, a storyteller, a man forever changed by the echoes of his past and the stark realities of his present. The summer months brought a renewed abundance to the forest. Berries ripened on the bush, fish teemed in the streams, and game was plentiful. Elias's body was fully adapted now, his movements efficient and silent. He was a master of his small domain, knowing every edible plant, every animal trail, every sheltered nook. His shelter was robust, his fire skills impeccable, his traps effective. He even managed to fashion a rudimentary raft from logs and vines, allowing him to explore further down the stream, carefully navigating the shallow rapids. It was on one of these excursions, drifting silently downstream, that he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible rumble, like distant thunder, but too steady, too rhythmic for a natural phenomenon. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. It was the sound of an engine, a plane. His first reaction was a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline, a desperate hope that sent shivers down his spine. He jumped off his raft, scrambling to the bank, looking up at the sky, his eyes scanning the vast blue expanse. But the forest canopy was too thick, and the sound, faint as it was, seemed to move away, fading into the immense silence once more. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over him. He stood there for a long time, listening, straining to catch another whisper of the engine, but it was gone. The forest had swallowed it whole. He felt a profound sense of frustration, a sudden, desperate urge to scream, to make his presence known. He had spent so long adapting, so long building this life, that the idea of rescue, once a constant dream, had receded. Now it had been dangled before him, only to be snatched away. The incident reignited the dormant spark of hope, but also a fierce sense of urgency. He realized he couldn't simply rely on chance. He needed a plan, a strategy to signal. He remembered the open meadow he had found months ago, a perfect spot for a signal fire. He began to gather large quantities of green branches, knowing they would produce thick, visible smoke. He also started arranging large rocks in the meadow, attempting to spell out an SOS, though the sheer scale of such a task was daunting. The distant rumble had shaken him from his quiet equilibrium. It reminded him that there was still a world beyond this forest, a world that might still be looking for him, or at least a world that passed by overhead. The silence of the forest, once a comfort, now felt like a barrier, a thick wall separating him from humanity. He worked with a renewed intensity, fueled by this fresh wave of hope and desperation. He was no longer content to simply survive. He wanted to be found. He wanted to go home. The distant rumble, though fleeting, had become a powerful catalyst, pulling him back towards the idea of rescue, towards the echoes of his lost life. Days turned into weeks, each one a painstaking effort to prepare his signal. Elias dedicated almost all his waking hours to the meadow. He cleared more of the undergrowth, expanding the open space. He hauled heavy logs and rocks to form the letters SOS, making them as large and as visible as possible from the air. It was backbreaking labor, but the image of a plane spotting his message, of rescue finally arriving, fueled his every swing of the axe, every lift of a heavy stone. His primary focus, however, was the signal fire. He built a large pyre in the center of the meadow, a towering stack of dry logs and branches, topped with a substantial pile of green, leafy material. He kept it covered with a makeshift tarp of woven bark and leaves, protecting it from rain and damp. Beside it, he always had a small, ready-to-light kindling pile and his reliable lighter. He was ready. Now, he just needed an opportunity. He spent hours each day in the meadow, gazing at the sky, listening. Every distant buzz, every faint hum sent his heart racing. He would drop everything, rushing to uncover his pyre, ready to light the signal. But each time, it was either the sound of the wind, or an animal, or a plane too far away, too high, too fast. The waiting was agonizing, a slow torture that chipped away at his resolve. The vastness of the sky, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like an indifferent, empty expanse. One afternoon, as he was collecting more green branches, a clear, unmistakable drone filled the air, louder than before. Closer, Elias dropped his armload of branches and sprinted towards the meadow, his lungs burning, his legs pumping. This was it. He could feel it. He tore away the tarp, grabbed his lighter, and with trembling hands, ignited the kindling. The dry wood caught quickly, sending flames licking upwards. He then piled on the green branches, watching anxiously as thick white smoke billowed into the clear blue sky. He kept looking up, frantically searching for the source of the sound. And then he saw it. A tiny speck, a small propeller plane, flying low, directly towards the valley. It was too far to tell if they had seen him, but his heart surged with a desperate hope. He waved his arms wildly, yelling, his voice hoarse, raw. The plane continued its path, flying past his position, then began a slow, deliberate turn. Had they seen the smoke? Had they seen the SOS? The plane slowly circled once, twice. It dipped its wings, a clear sign of acknowledgement. Elias collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face, a choked sob escaping his lips. They had seen him. After all this time, all this struggle, all this silence, he was found. The smoke, a beacon of his survival, rose high into the sky, a triumphant plume against the indifferent blue. He was no longer alone. The signal fire, painstakingly prepared, had done its job. Rescue was coming. The long, silent vigil was finally over. The plane circled a third time, lower this time, and Elias could clearly see the pilot waving. A profound sense of unreality settled over him. Was this truly happening? After all the months, all the solitude, all the despair, rescue was finally here. The plane made another pass, then banked sharply and began to ascend, disappearing over the peaks. Elias knew they were likely returning to base to coordinate a ground rescue or perhaps a helicopter. The waiting, though now filled with hope, was still agonizing. He kept his signal fire burning, adding more green branches whenever the smoke thinned, a constant beacon in the vast wilderness. Hours stretched into an eternity. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. Elias paced the meadow, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, joy, anticipation, but also a strange, unexpected pang of something akin to sadness. This forest, which had been his prison, had also become his home. He had fought it, cursed it, but also learned to love it, to respect its immense power and beauty. The thought of leaving it, of returning to the cacophony of the city, felt almost alien. As twilight deepened, a new sound reached his ears, a deeper, more powerful thrum than the small plane, a helicopter. Its distinctive thud-thud-thud grew steadily louder, cutting through the evening stillness. Soon, a powerful searchlight swept across the meadow, illuminating his signal fire. His SOS, it was a large, military-grade helicopter, its blades churning the air into a powerful vortex, whipping up dust and leaves. He shielded his eyes, the light blinding after months of natural illumination. The helicopter slowly descended, hovering above the meadow, kicking up a storm of debris. A figure emerged from the side door, signaling to him. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a sudden, overwhelming shyness. He hadn't spoken to another human being in what felt like a lifetime. The first rescuer, a man in a tactical uniform, fast roped down, followed quickly by another. They moved with a practiced efficiency, their faces etched with relief and concern. The first rescuer reached him, his voice muffled by the helicopter's roar. "Elias Thorne?" he shouted, extending a hand. Elias could only nod, tears blurring his vision. He tried to speak, but his throat was tight, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. The rescuer gently guided him towards a stretcher, checking him for immediate injuries. He was weak, exhausted, but otherwise remarkably well. As they prepared to hoist him into the helicopter, Elias took one last look at his camp, at the towering trees, at the stream, at the dying embers of his signal fire. He knew he was leaving a part of himself behind, a primal, untamed part that had been forged in the crucible of solitude and survival. He was going home, but he was not the same man who had left. The descent of hope was not just a rescue. It was a transition, a passage from one life to another, forever changed by the silence he had endured. The journey out of the wilderness was a blur of medical attention, hushed voices, and the jarring reality of human contact. Elias was wrapped in a thermal blanket, offered warm drinks, and subjected to a battery of initial medical checks. His body, once lean and hardened, now felt strangely fragile in the presence of so many people. The helicopter ride was loud, overwhelming after months of silence, but he clung to the comfort of the rescuer's steady presence beside him. He answered questions in a raspy voice, struggling to articulate the vastness of his experience. When they landed, it was not in a remote outpost, but at a small regional airport. The tarmac was swarming with emergency vehicles, flashing lights, and a throng of reporters, their cameras flashing like 1,000 hungry eyes. The sight was overwhelming, a stark and brutal contrast to the quiet solitude he had just left. He shielded his eyes, feeling a profound sense of disorientation. The world remembered him. The world cared. But it was too much, too fast. His parents were there, their faces etched with a year of grief and worry, now transformed into expressions of raw, disbelieving joy. His mother rushed forward, embracing him tightly, her sobs muffled against his shoulder. His father, usually reserved, clasped his hand, his eyes shining with unshed tears. It was a moment of profound, overwhelming reunion, a reconnection to the love he had almost forgotten. The pain of their separation, the guilt he had carried, finally began to lift. The medical team quickly whisked him away, shielding him from the media frenzy. He underwent thorough examinations, his gaunt frame and calloused hands a testament to his ordeal. Doctors marveled at his resilience, his physical condition surprisingly stable despite the extreme circumstances. He was malnourished, dehydrated, and covered in scars, but his spirit, though weary, was intact. He answered their questions about his survival, what he ate, how he built shelter, how he made fire. His story, once a solitary struggle, was now becoming a phenomenon. He was given a private room, a soft bed, a hot meal. The simple luxuries were almost too much to bear. The taste of fresh food, the warmth of a real bed, the quiet hum of air conditioning, each sensation was a shock to his system. He found himself restless, unable to sleep, the silence of the hospital room feeling oppressive, artificial. He missed the sounds of the forest, the crackle of his fire, the soft murmur of the stream. He missed the raw, authentic reality of his wilderness life. The world had remembered him, pulling him back from the brink of oblivion. But in doing so, it also reminded him of the profound chasm that now existed between the man he once was and the man he had become. He was home, but home felt strangely unfamiliar. A world he no longer fully understood, and one that no longer fully understood him. The initial days of recovery were a strange blend of comfort and discomfort. Elias was showered with care and concern from his family, friends, and even strangers captivated by his story. He ate real food, gained weight, and slowly, his physical wounds began to heal. Yet the weight of civilization pressed down on him. The constant noise, traffic, televisions, conversations was a relentless assault on his senses, accustomed to the profound quiet of the forest. He found himself jumpy, easily startled, constantly scanning his surroundings as if for unseen threats. His old apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt sterile and confining. The soft carpets, the polished furniture, the myriad of electronic gadgets, all seemed alien. He missed the earthy smell of pine and damp soil, the rough texture of bark, the open sky above his head. He found solace in long walks in nearby parks, seeking out the quietest, most natural spaces. But even these felt manicured tame, a pale imitation of the wild heart he had known. Conversations were difficult. People wanted to hear his story, to understand what he had endured. He tried to explain, to convey the raw beauty and brutal reality of his survival, but the words felt inadequate, hollow. How could he describe the feeling of true hunger to someone who had never known it? How could he explain the profound connection he felt to a single, crackling fire to those who took warmth for granted? Their questions, though well-intentioned, often felt superficial, reducing his year-long ordeal to a sensational tale. He struggled with the expectations placed upon him. He was a hero, a symbol of human resilience. But inside, he felt like an imposter. He was just a man who had done what he needed to do to survive. The fame, the media attention, the constant requests for interviews, it was all overwhelming. He longed for the anonymity of the forest, the simple clarity of his daily struggle. He craved the silence, the profound, honest silence that had been his constant companion. His relationships with friends and family were strained. They loved him, but they didn't understand him. He was different, changed in ways that were hard to articulate. He found himself withdrawing, preferring solitude even in the midst of people. He spent hours sketching not blueprints for buildings, but detailed drawings of the forest, his shelter, the animals he had observed. It was his way of reconnecting with the world he had left behind, a tangible link to the man he had become. The weight of civilization was heavy, a constant reminder of the chasm that now separated him from his old life. He was a survivor, yes, but he was also an outsider, a man carrying the silent echoes of the wild in his soul, struggling to find his place in a world that no longer felt like home. Weeks turned into months, and Elias slowly began to navigate the complexities of his new existence. He sought therapy, recognizing the need to process the trauma and the profound changes he had undergone. It was a slow, arduous process, but it helped him articulate his experiences, to understand the depth of his transformation. He learned to manage the sensory overload, to find moments of quietude amidst the urban hum. He started to reconnect with his family, patiently explaining his feelings, helping them understand the new man he had become. He eventually left his architect job. The sterile environment of the office, the endless meetings, the pursuit of material wealth, it all felt hollow, meaningless after his time in the wild. He realized his values had fundamentally shifted. He no longer craved the accolades or the financial success. He yearned for purpose, for authenticity, for a life lived in harmony with the natural world. This decision was met with confusion and concern from some, but Elias knew it was the right path. He began to volunteer for environmental conservation groups, his intimate knowledge of the wilderness proving invaluable. He taught survival skills to underprivileged youth, sharing the lessons he had learned about resilience, resourcefulness, and respect for nature. He found a new sense of purpose in these endeavors, a way to bridge the gap between his two lives. He also found a new North Star in his passion for nature photography and writing. He bought a simple camera and returned to the wilderness, not as a desperate survivor, but as a respectful observer. He captured the raw beauty of the landscapes, the subtle movements in animals, the intricate details of flora. His photographs were stark, honest, imbued with the deep connection he felt to the wild. His birch bark diary evolved into a more formal journal, and he began to write about his experiences not as a sensational tale, but as a reflective account of human endurance and transformation. He started spending regular periods in the wilderness again, carefully prepared and equipped, but always seeking the quiet solitude, the profound connection. He would build small, temporary shelters, light fires, forage, and simply exist within the natural rhythms. These retreats were not about survival anymore, but about spiritual nourishment, a way to ground himself, to remember the profound lessons the forest had taught him. He still carried the scars, both visible and invisible, of his ordeal. He would never fully shed the memories of hunger, cold, and loneliness. But he had found a way to integrate his past with his present, to forge a new path that honored both the man he was and the man he had become. Elias Thorne had lost his way in the silence, but in doing so, he had found his true self, his new North Star, guiding him towards a life of purpose and profound connection to the heart of nature. The lessons of the wild were not confined to survival skills. They had permeated every aspect of Elias's being, reshaping his worldview. He learned the profound value of simplicity. In the forest, every item had a purpose, every action had a consequence. He carried this lesson into his new life, decluttering his existence, focusing on what truly mattered: relationships, experiences, and a deeper connection to the world around him. He found joy in minimalist living, appreciating the profound richness found in having less. He developed an unparalleled appreciation for the natural world. What most people took for granted, clean water, fresh air, a starry night sky, Elias revered his sacred gifts. He became an advocate for conservation, using his story not for fame, but as a powerful testament to the beauty and fragility of untouched wilderness. He spoke passionately about protecting these vital spaces, ensuring future generations could experience the raw, transformative power of nature. His relationship with time had also changed. The frantic pace of urban life, the constant pressure to be productive, to rush from one task to another, now seemed absurd. He had learned to live by the rhythms of the sun and seasons, to embrace patience, to savor each moment. He moved through life with a calm deliberation, a quiet awareness that allowed him to truly experience the present rather than constantly chasing the future. He also learned the immense power of resilience, both physical and mental. He had faced true despair, the gnawing fear of death, and had found the strength to keep going. This inner fortitude became a wellspring he could draw upon in any challenge. He understood that he was capable of far more than he had ever imagined, a profound self-knowledge forged in the crucible of solitude. The concept of true self-reliance was another profound lesson. While he embraced community and collaboration in his new life, he carried with him the quiet confidence that he could face any adversity, that he possessed the inner resources to survive. This wasn't arrogance. It was a deep, reassuring knowledge of his own capabilities, a quiet strength born from having faced the ultimate test. Elias often returned to the specific valley where he had crashed, a pilgrimage he undertook once a year. He would stand by the stream, visit the site of his old shelter, now reclaimed by the forest, and simply breathe. These visits were not about reliving the trauma, but about remembering the genesis of his transformation, paying homage to the place that had broken him down and rebuilt him into a new, more profound version of himself. The lessons of the wild were not just memories. They were the very fabric of his new life, guiding his choices, shaping his purpose, and deepening his understanding of what it truly meant to be alive. Years passed. Elias Thorne, the celebrated survivor, slowly faded from the headlines, replaced by new stories, new heroes. This was exactly what he wanted. He had found his quiet corner in the world, a life rich in purpose and connection, far removed from the clamor of his past. He continued his work with environmental groups, his voice now a respected authority on wilderness ethics and survival. His photography and writing gained a small, dedicated following, touched by the raw honesty and profound insight of his work. He built a small, rustic cabin on the edge of a vast, protected wilderness area, a place that reminded him of the solitude he had once endured, but now actively sought. It was a simple structure, built with his own hands, embodying the lessons of efficiency and harmony with nature. Here, he found a new kind of silence, not the oppressive void of his initial stranding, but a rich, resonant quiet filled with the subtle sounds of the natural world. This was a silence he had chosen, a silence that nurtured his soul. He often had visitors, fellow conservationists, young students eager to learn, or old friends who had finally come to understand the depth of his transformation. He shared his stories, his knowledge, his wisdom, always with a quiet humility. He never romanticized his ordeal, always emphasizing the brutal realities, but also the unexpected gifts it had bestowed upon him. He spoke of the fear, the loneliness, but also the profound beauty, the resilience of life, and the rediscovery of his own spirit. His parents, now older, would visit regularly, finding peace in his simple cabin, seeing the profound contentment in their son's eyes. They understood now. They saw that while they had lost the old Elias, they had gained someone stronger, wiser, more authentically himself. The love between them was deeper, forged in the fires of loss and miraculous reunion. Elias was at peace. He had faced death, stared into the abyss of absolute solitude, and emerged not broken, but remade. He carried the wilderness within him, not as a trauma, but as a source of strength and unending wonder. He understood that true survival was not just about staying alive. It was about finding meaning in existence, about connecting to something larger than oneself. He would often sit by the window of his cabin, watching the deer graze in the clearing, listening to the wind whisper through the pines, the distant call of an owl. The world was still vast, still indifferent, but he was no longer a stranger within it. He was a part of its fabric, a silent witness to its eternal dance. He had come full circle from being stranded in silence to finding his heart in nature's embrace. And in that embrace, he found not just survival, but a profound and lasting peace. A new silence filled with the echoes of a life truly lived.